Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever it is, wherever you are, welcome to the Good Values podcast. This episode, I speak to somebody who I've met once before, but our interview was unfortunately, it had a technical difficulty. When I first arrived, it started to rain and I put the equipment under shelter for a moment. And then when the rain eased, I set my equipment back up. I put a waterproof protection over my camera and I set it up clamped to an old black bin, which is thin plastic. And sadly, what had happened is, as we talked, the camera drooped slightly more and more as we progressed through the conversation. And we were both decapitated by the camera shot. We were out of frame, and it was only from the neck down that we were being captured. Now, I'm still going to release the audio for that conversation because it was fantastic. But in this video, this episode, it's going to be part one of a two-part release, and I'm considering releasing both parts together at a later date, but it'll be much longer. Now, the reason for that is that the first part is covering Britain and Ireland, and the second part is international work. This is a professional photographer, a wildlife activist and conservationist. Fantastic person. I'm really privileged to have had this conversation with them and to meet them. Now, we met up before the release of this episode, and there was some notes here and there. So if there's text on the screen and you are watching the video of this podcast, which for regular viewers, you may be aware that there isn't currently an audio version. I'm not sure if you are aware, but my plans for the future is to release the Good Values podcast as audio on the normal platforms where you find podcasts. But for now, it's video exclusively. So in the future, if you're watching this or listening to it, there is a video option. And if you're watching the video option, there will be some text notes that come onto the screen, which is just some of the thoughts and amendments that we made whilst we were viewing the edit. So without further ado, here is my conversation with David Woodfall. To begin, if I could ask you to introduce yourself for the audience, please.
Hello, my name is David Woodfall. I'm a photographer that specialises in environmental issues, conservation, wildlife, landscape, portraits, our relationship with the natural world, the good, the bad and the ugly.
Fantastic. Well, what areas of conservation have you been involved in?
After my first degree, I started working with the Nature Conservancy Council. I was an estate worker, educationalist and a warden for 2 years. During this time, I looked at beetles on the sand dune system in Oxwich, Gower, where I'm from, and moved then to the Northumberland coast, where for 6 years I was the coastal warden, including protecting my favourite bird, the little tern. Then I went to London for 2 years and I set up a project for inner city school children in Epping Forest. That was in every sense a dramatic challenge to the social side of me, the conservation side, and actually in time, I think it's perhaps the most interesting I've done. Then I went to the Lancashire Wildlife Trust, which was one of the worst experiences of my life. Now, I was going to become a photographer, but it preempted it because my contract wasn't renewed. Sadly, at that time, there was no one at Lancashire Wildlife Trust who knew anything about conservation. It's very different now, but as they didn't renew my contract, I became a freelance photographer in 1988.
Oh, wow.
Now, that was really opportune time because that was just when the Green Movement was taking place. Effectively, and I might be slightly incorrect when I say this, forgive me, Gary Brash up in heaven, but I was possibly the only photographer in the world specialising in what I do. So And that gave me all the motivation I need to show what I could do, because the 3 previous years I felt that people didn't remotely understand what my talents were.
Yeah.
So I things went really well for me. In at the end of that first year, I won a category of the Wildlife Photographer of the Year.
That's fantastic.
And that gave me, I wasn't even known in the village I lived as a photographer. And suddenly people all over the world were coming to my door. So that was a really interesting challenge. And it meant I survived, because that's how you see the first year. Because being an artist is like jumping out of a plane without a parachute.
Yeah.
And you need something that no one else has got.
Yeah.
And what made the Wildlife Photographer of the Year very different to what I had previously happened in that category was the category depicted a place called Wastwater in the Lake District National Park. And I'd made a very unusual photograph of an island at last light with Great Gable behind in total darkness, shadow, murk. And it was very symbolic. The island was golden. It was very symbolic of how my life has been. So it was art and life, mirroring life, really. And I'm that sort of person anyway. So that's the first time a British photograph had won the Wild Places category. Normally it's foreign, exotic places, but I'd shown if you get the right conditions. And that's the key. The way I like to work, Simon, is to pre-visualise the photographs I want. So I'll find something that interests me and I'll go back maybe 50 times.
I see.
Until I get the conditions. And then the best analogy for that is it's like a painting to me. And I hadn't owned a camera till I was 24, and that was deliberate. I didn't want a camera getting in the way of my experience with life. Age 5, my parents got the standard Encyclopedia Britannica set, and I doubt there were many 6-year-olds who knew as much about Goya as I did.
Oh, fantastic.
So it was a visual stimulus that was very, very intense.
Yeah, incredible. Well, would you have any advice for anyone these days who are getting into photography? What would you say is a good...
It's a very, very difficult time now.
Yeah.
I'm fairly hardline about photography.
Yeah.
I say 40 million people in the UK own a camera. And there's maybe 100 photographers in Britain now.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
I don't want to put anyone off. I want to be real about it. Just do it in the weekends and evenings. I remember someone asking the same question to Faye Godwin, who was a heroine of mine when I started out. Her book, seminal book, Land. And I got so into that book, I think I lived more in the book, The Land, than actually on the land. And someone asked the same question in a lecture she gave, and she said, "You'll starve." And it's kind of good to be like that, because it's real. Faye was real, and the pictures were real. I'm not interested in artifice. So Faye was one of a number of people that helped me hugely, and I basically went to the photographer's gallery for weekend after weekend after weekend, and went through, at that time in 83, 84, I just went through every periodical, every book, and it was the time in the history of photography for documentary photography. And at the same time, there was a photographer based in Tasmania called Peter Dombrovskis. I discovered in BBC Wildlife a review of this book. David Bellamy was prepared to go to prison to stop the Franklin Valley being flooded. Peter Dombrovskis used a 10.8 camera and documented it over many years. That valley was saved. And that was my template. Use the camera to communicate the issues about conservation. Mm. So, because of economics, I decided basically I was going to concentrate on Britain and Ireland. I wasn't going to do very much wildlife because there were loads of rather strange term semi-professional photographers whose hobby was wildlife photography. So I had to value my time. That first year, I didn't make a lot of photographs, really. And I am a photographer that looks at most of what I do is making them. I belong to that camp, if you like, rather than taking them, although I will take pictures as well. And that's something perhaps for the listener to kind of read up rather than me for talk to about 4 hours.
I was just about to ask you about the difference between making and taking photographs.
Making is when you construct the photograph. Taking is when you accept what the world throws at you.
Yeah, and you make photographs.
Yes, mostly.
Yeah.
On a good day.
Yeah.
So that's what I set out to do. Now, I'd set myself a task. In about 1982, I documented the beginning of a book between the landscape, people and wildlife of Britain and Ireland. So I was just working away quietly. I started getting commissions, and I moved from Lancashire to North Wales in 1990, the January, and I've been here ever since. They can't get rid of me. And it's a really great small town, Denbigh, to live in because people just let you be yourself. Mm. There's a mental asylum on the outskirts. Yeah. A strong protection and care for people who are different. And I certainly fall into that category. And just people are very straight, wonderful community, sort of community that hardly exists in Britain now. Mm. And importantly for me, it's right in the middle of Britain.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's quite important because then it means if I want to go to the Scottish Highlands, it's not too far. If I want to go to Cornwall, it's not too far. And if I want to go to Ireland, Holyhead Ferry.
Yeah.
And if I want to go abroad, which will be the next podcast, Manchester Airport.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So it's kind of great. I love music. I go to Manchester and Liverpool loads. Fantastic for music, for poetry, literature. Didn't really enough time to do everything you want.
Well, did you say you started off when you were 24 when you really started to
I bought a camera. I wasn't serious.
No, you weren't serious.
I'm one of these people that don't read the manual, so yeah. I thought depth of field went sideways. I didn't realise it meant backwards and forwards. So I didn't, it was very instinctive. I had every kind of rejections. A very famous photographer, Brian Shule, got me an appointment with the biggest agency in Europe at the time, and I lasted a minute. They didn't like what I had because technically it wasn't very strong. What Brian had seen was my eye. We've all, the advice I'd give to anyone listening, we've all got unique eyes. Most people forget they have. So in that first year, I went to the Mersey Estuary. There'd been an oil spill, and I wanted to document it. They cleaned up most of it by the time I got there, so it might sound odd, but I was a bit frustrated. So I walked up a bit, and I found an outflow from a large chemical. I made a photograph of it, and in fact, I made a photograph of it because I waited 3 hours until...
Do you have any pushback when you do things like this? 'Cause it sounds as though you're maybe exposing oversights by corporations, and they can be quite defensive against their own...
There was no one there.
Wasn't there? Fantastic.
So I waited 3 hours to make the photograph till there was a black sky, which gave it a counterpoint. That's a technique I use a lot. It's very simple. Musicians use it when they're composing music. You've got something in the foreground, and then you use something to reinforce the information in the photograph and what you're trying to say. And it was a black sky. It was pollution. And I used a lot at that time. I used a medium format Mamiya camera, with a very wide lens. And so I got the whole lot in. Low, I was probably kneeling in it. And anyway, the next year that was runner-up. And they're quite important. So then relates to the advice on people becoming photographers. When you find something interesting, keep going back to the same place. So I went back and I walked up the Mersey and I found another outfall. Someone from that company saw what I was doing, came down with a hard hat and a German Shepherd and said, "Oh, you're from Greenpeace, aren't you?" So I said, "No, I'm from a small town in North Wales." So he laughed and said, "That's all right." Talked to me for 10 minutes. I had old clothes on. And he underestimated me. Or so I thought. As he walked away, he turned over his shoulder and said, "You've got 5 years." What he was telling me, that company wouldn't be there in 5 years' time, so I had 5 years to make more photographs. And it's an interesting, sometimes the enemy is actually your friend.
Yeah.
So when those things happen, don't get defensive yourself, just be dead relaxed. When you're relaxed, you're not a threat.
Yeah.
So I went back 50 times. I had every colour in the spectrum of pollution. From the first photograph, an agency called Tony Stone came, and it started to change very quickly, the commercial side of what I did. They wouldn't keep very many pictures. From those 50 visits and thousands of photographs, they kept 8 photographs. Those 8 photographs each sold between 200 and 400 times. So that bankrolled me.
Yeah.
I had something no one in the world had at a time when there was rampant pollution. And that enabled me to be myself and to do the quirky, strange photography that is David Woodfall. So I could just be myself. Yeah. And that's why I would say anyone starting out, it's the strangest things that actually make the difference, whether you survive, whether you do well, whether you get recognition. Don't be afraid of any of it.
Where have you found problems with environmental discussions? Have you found anything where there's a barrier, where people want to stop the conversation?
There's always a barrier because people don't always want the truth. They want what fuels their lives, whether they're paid by a multinational or whether it's a convenient lifestyle. We're at a time approaching the apocalypse. And I'm fairly understated, but I've seen some fairly horrific things. And climate change, I remember back in doing my first degree, I did quaternary studies, which is basically the study of the last 14,000 years since the Ice Age, which is climate change, because we looked at the factors. And there we were, a bunch of green students. I was really passionate about ecology then, and ecology was the other options I did. And our lecturer in quaternary studies encouraged us to explore the different factors that change the planet in that period. So we came up with 8 or 9, and we had a really good discussion about it. And then there was a silence, and he said, "Well, maybe we've changed the climate." So we said, how come people change the climate? And he just said CO2. We all laughed. Because it wasn't at that level, it wasn't even realised.
Okay.
I started reading books fairly quickly.
Yeah.
Within a year, I was working for the NCC, as I said. And I realised not only that climate change was the major force in society, that the government had known about climate change in the 50s and decided after the Second World War to go for economic growth, which you can understand.
Yeah.
But it's a very short-sighted way of looking at things. So climate change was central to my work from then on.
Yeah.
So I'd weave environmental issues into a wildlife photograph when I later developed into a wildlife photographer.
Yeah.
So the first challenge I had, other than meeting the increasing number of commissions I received, was to continue my book. I found writer Kenny Taylor, and we wrote a book called Natural Heartlands.
Was the challenge to get the momentum to feed it, or to have the vision to know what it needed? What was the challenge when it came to making the book? What was it that you remember?
Just to keep going.
To keep going,
Yeah. I was busy. I was really, really busy. But just that, when you know what you want, you always find what you're looking for. You always, and the trick is, it often comes in ways you're not expecting. And recognition, really, to answer your question, Simon. And I came in unexpected ways. I remember I had a problem with my engine in Caithness. And so I just walked out on the peak bog. And first, I didn't know it. I was on one of the best blanket bogs in Europe. I'd already taken a flight over the flow country and got some really dramatic aerial photographs. But I went out on one of the best quaking bogs. And again, I had a black sky, late afternoon, November light. And then I kept going. And I met a bunch of salmon fishermen from Wick, Salmon Fishing Association, who were catching the salmon. So I documented the whole lot. It's just understanding. I am to cameras what Pete Townsend is to guitars, really. I break them regularly, it's just a tool. But I am to chaos what Paul Gascoigne was to scoring great goals. Is that I kind of embrace it. And when you do that and don't worry about the time, about responsibilities temporarily, it's that you come across the most extraordinary things. I kind of sometimes wonder if there's someone sitting upstairs inventing everything for me, because it seems so perfect. The truth is, all I'm doing is enhancing the chaos in the world by accepting it and not being too controlling with my time or with other people.
But you have to be prepared to be.
You have to be prepared. You have to know exactly what you want.
Yeah.
So that when it happens, you don't get overexcited. You're dead calm.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of people have noticed I do quite a lot of talks, and they said it's a really interesting dialectic between the calmness of your photographs, David, and the energy you project when you talk. So those are two different bows in my arrow, you might say.
Yeah.
And I use them wisely, or try to, on a good day.
I've got a strange technical question I just popped into my head, which is, it's a compositional question. And I'm going to relate it to an artist called Norman Rockwell, who found out about the golden section and the rule of thirds after he'd had a fairly lengthy career. And then he started to impose this structure onto his artwork. And he followed all the guides and the measurements. And then he started to purposely shift everything off these guides and measurements to see if it made a difference. And his conclusion was that he didn't find it was necessarily that impactful so long as he used his own preference to compose the image. Do you follow the rule of thirds, the golden section? Do you find those things to be anything which should be aside from a general rule, is it anything which is,
it's a really good question, because behind it lies your whole work ethic, what you produce.
Yeah.
Not at all, is the straight answer. Again, when I was 6 and I was into Goya, what struck me by all the artists I looked at was their amazing composition.
Yeah.
Now, artists got a huge advantage over photographers. It's that they can rub it out and start again. Now, the equivalent, you could say, is digital photography.
Yeah.
But to me, composition was central, and I kind of had an artistic approach subconsciously all my life until I was 24 through my immersion in art. And a colleague looked at one of my pictures and said, "It's a nice photograph of a mountain, David, but I'd rub it out top left." And it set me thinking. So I just became it became totally imbued in me. And obviously spending, weekends on end woodshedding in the photographer's gallery meant that I put it central. One of the problems with digital photography, and this is a problem for the future of photography, it's so easy now, people don't think about composition.
To doctor what you have.
Well, they think I can change it.
Yeah.
Well, you can't change the composition. Once the composition, that's it. So that's how important it is to me. And I've always kept it subconscious. So
to have balance.
Yeah, to have balance within something. And also composition is vital, what message you convey. Obviously with environmental issues, it's rather important.
Yeah.
And in wildlife now, because wildlife's central. And photographing people. So I'm very laissez-faire about it, but I know exactly what works for me. That's sort of odd to be like that, but that's just the way I am.
I suppose there's another thing which people have been discussing recently, which is initially the considerations for composition were based on rectangles, and these days there's a lot more square imagery being released due to certain applications on phones and things having square tablets that you really cater things for.
Yeah.
How do you think composition fits into square frames?
Well, I've got a slightly unusual answer. One of the early, when I went freelance, I spent my mother was very ill. She had a number of valves put on her heart. And I spent the week in London when just before and during, after the operation. And I went to a Paul Klee exhibition 3 times. Same one. And he kind of used rectangles very often. And it set my mind ringing that although I'm very much of a free spirit, that you have to have a composition based on something, the form.
Yeah.
So someone like Paul Klee dealt with it head on. And then you look at other aspects of Paul Klee's work, and it's totally liberating. So he's not confined by anything.
Yeah.
So that had a big effect on me, and then how I worked.
Okay, so that is the episode for now, part 1. I hope you enjoyed it. I thought it was a lovely conversation. I really appreciated his passion and how enthusiastic he was for some of these causes. A fantastic storyteller and beautiful photographs. I only showed you a fragment of his work, and I will be showing more in the second part. Also, you may have noticed we are sat in front of a large horizontal banner, and that will be explained what that is and the background and story towards the construction, the making of that photograph in the next part. So if you did enjoy the episode, please leave a like, comment down below, consider subscribing and ringing the notification bell. It supports this channel and I greatly appreciate it. But otherwise, share this with anyone who you think might enjoy the conversation. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next episode.